Hello, my name's Nic Newman, and I'm the lead author of our annual Reuters Institute Digital News Report. And in this short talk, I'm going to pull out some of the data relating to the Asia-Pacific region with a focus on trust, misinformation, and also some of the changes we're seeing in the social media landscape, particularly with younger generations. The survey as a whole covers 46 markets, including 11 now in the Asia-Pacific region. There they are. And a reminder of the methodology. So this is based on online polling, and as such, it will tend to slightly underrepresent some traditional news behaviors. I should also point out that our sample in India is English-speaking and younger, so not always directly comparable with some of the other markets. The survey was conducted on our behalf by YouGov in January, early February 2022, and the report is supported by 15 different news organizations and also Google, media regulations, and academic institutions too. So first, just to set the scene, a little bit about the changes in consumption that we've seen over time. And I'm going to start with Japan, where you can see quite clearly the decline of some traditional media. So television there, 73% to 56%, decline in print, 46% to 27%. And what's interesting is that online remains pretty flat over the period, so not really making up the gap. And part of the reason for that becomes apparent when we add this line for the proportion that say they've consumed none of these sources of news over the last week. And you can see that increasing from 4% in 2015 to 15% over that time period. So an increased disconnection with news effectively. Let's look at Australia, another example. Again, the same basic trends, print and TV on the slide, radio too, and then online not really making up that gap. And again, if we add that line about the proportion that say they haven't consumed any of these sources in the last week, you can see that increase. That now stands at 8% in Australia. Then there's another group which we identify in this report, which is different from those who don't consume any news. So these are people who do consume news regularly, but they also say they selectively avoid the news sometimes or often. So 38% say they do this now across all countries, and that's up from 29% in 2017. Avoidance has doubled in a number of countries like the Brazil and the UK, for example. But if we look at Asia Pacific, the increases haven't been quite as strong, but still significant, and very high levels of news avoidance in countries where we don't have historical data. But for this year, Philippines, India, for example, over 40%. When we ask people why they're avoiding the news, the top reasons are pretty similar across countries. They include the people feeling that there's just too much repetitive news about certain subjects, politics, COVID-19. Around a third say that the news brings their mood down, has a negative effect on how they're feeling. That's particularly younger people, it's particularly women. 29% say the news can't be trusted. That's why they're avoiding it. And then similar number say that they just feel worn out by the amount of news these days. And we can bring some of that to life with quotes from our qualitative interviews this year. So here's somebody talking about avoiding the news about politics, feeling their views are not really taken into account. And then here's somebody else who says that they're avoiding the news that triggers their anxiety. So if we look now at trust, and last year we saw a bit of a bounce in the trust figures for the news as people were really looking for reliable news around the COVID crisis. This year we see that reversing, at least to some extent, the headline figures down in almost half our markets, up in only 7. But we find a lot of variation across regions. So in Thailand, for example, around half say they trust the news most of the time. But that figure is much lower in countries like South Korea or in territories like Taiwan. Elsewhere, we see, again, these splits, very high trust in Finland, very low trust in the United States. And a lot of this is about, the polarization that we've seen in many societies, particularly the US, for example, that sense that the media is on your side or not on your side. That sense that the media can't be trusted. But we also find another factor is that in some parts of the world, and this is particularly true in Asia, people feel the media is not sufficiently independent, that powerful politicians or businessmen are exercising undue influence on editors or journalists, either directly or maybe through indirect means like withholding government advertising. And we see here just 25% in the Asia Pacific countries we cover say they feel the media is free from political influence, and a similar number for business. If we move on to misinformation, and across our entire survey, we find high levels of concern about whether people can tell the difference between what is true and what is false online when it comes to news, 54%. That's higher in some parts of Asia. And when we ask people what types of false and misleading information they see, they talk about politics and they talk about COVID-19. A few other topics as well, such as climate change, celebrity misinformation, products and scams as well. And in some countries, like the Philippines, for example, people say they see more political misinformation than some of these other categories. So 64% in the Philippines say they saw political misinformation in the last week, which is well above the average. This, of course, was during the election season in the Philippines, which probably explains it. The role of platforms and digital intermediaries is critical here. And every year we ask respondents how they access news online. Where do they start their journey? This chart uses data from all countries about their preferred gateways. And what you can see here is social media every year becoming more important in terms of preferences. So 28% say they prefer now to access via social media, compared with just 23% directly. And actually, in many Asian countries, you can see that preference for social network access being much stronger than the average. So in Thailand, 59% compared with 28% as the average. And of course, that's likely to be fueling less reliable information in those societies. So what do we mean when we talk about social networks in the news? And what's interesting is there are very significant differences across the region. So India, for example, the key networks for news and for any purpose are YouTube and WhatsApp. So it's not surprising that that's where we've seen a lot of the concern about misinformation. In the Philippines, by contrast, it's actually Facebook that remains dominant. 73% say they use Facebook for news in the previous week. YouTube's also important. And we're starting to see other networks such as TikTok now picking up, particularly with younger users. And then just to take one final example, in Taiwan, you can see Line is actually the #1 network for news alongside Facebook, alongside YouTube. Twitter, of course, is important with influencers, and then younger users increasingly choosing networks like Instagram, networks like TikTok. TikTok, by the way, is the fastest growing network for news in our survey this year and has got a lot of attention, partly because of the Ukraine conflict, and traditional brands like the BBC increasingly represented alongside influencers and ordinary people. And across all countries, 40% of under 25 are now using TikTok for any purpose, 15% for news. So this is becoming very significant. And in countries like Thailand, 22%, the highest in our survey, say they are now using TikTok for news. So finally, just a few takeaways. In a number of countries, we find a significant proportion now disconnecting from the news, or at least selectively avoiding stories that might bring down their mood. We find that trust in the media is down in most countries, partly reversing the gains made during the COVID crisis. Polarization is a factor, but so too are perceptions of a lack of independence from powerful politicians and businessmen. Levels of concern about misinformation and disinformation remain extremely high across the region. That's about politics. It's also about health and other issues. Social media is increasingly a compelling gateway to news across the Asia-Pacific region, especially from the young, and that process is accelerating. And then finally, the types of networks that people use for news is changing, with attention in some countries switching from Facebook to some of those newer networks like Instagram and TikTok. And increasingly, that is the focus for concern about misinformation. More information on our website, the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, but also some of the work we do on trust and misinformation. Thanks very much.